So the perception of privacy is the topic here, and now obviously this is a perception is rather a psychological topic, which of course might seem strange that an engineer presents topics of perception, but of course there's so everything in privacy is very multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary. So could claim that no one really is an expert of the perception of any topic in privacy is always multidisciplinary. So even if I'm an engineer, I feel like I can talk about this. And so this talk is now, so like the perception is the starting point. This will end up in a bit of different places, but that's kind of just the logical outcome of when you try to think about perception. And my name was also already mentioned, Tom Bäckström, and I'm at the Aalto University. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask also or interrupt me in the middle. I'll edit those out from the recording afterwards. So perception, we start, of course, so audience here should already know what privacy is, but I perhaps still can start with the definition of my own. So personal privacy, it's about the information about myself, and there is some ownership involved. So I feel a ownership towards the information about myself. So there's three different concepts here. So there's the information about myself, and there's the concept of ownership. And then what I think perhaps is unique to my vision of this is that it's something that I feel. So there's a psychological component here immediately. So of course, typically people talk about the right to privacy as a human right, but I see that as a consequence. So we need that human right because people need kind of privacy. So psychological studies have shown that if you remove privacy from people, for example, prisoners can be exposed to a situation where they don't have any privacy. So that is psychologically very damaging. So we have a fundamental need for privacy, and that's the reason why we have the human right, or we talk about the human right of privacy. And also this ownership concept is quite central to this talk here, is that so the privacy always includes some sort of control. So you need to have private privacy or ownership. You need to have control over that information. All right, but then let's get moving for the main part here. So the kind of question is then, if we talk about perception of privacy with relationships to speech technology, is the question of what do users want with respect to privacy. And that's on one hand a obvious answer, but on the other hand perhaps also non-obvious. So in my view, users just want to feel safe. I don't believe that users actually want to think about privacy. They want to have meaningful interactions with their friends, for example, like in this picture here. They are interested in that interaction, and everything which endangers that interaction is like a distraction. So in some sense, privacy is kind of, when you want to feel safe, that's an absence of fear. So it's not the feeling in itself. So we could ask that, what does privacy feel like? But privacy doesn't feel like anything, because it's the absence of fear. So that's kind of a starting point here. But this is a bit dangerous than to just focus on how privacy feels, or like the feeling level, because a fraudster, so criminal or an evil company or spies, they can induce a feeling of safety. Users can feel entirely safe when they are being exploited. And that's the job of fraudsters. They develop expertise on that thing. So the users, I mean, they cannot really defend against that. They are defending against experts. But that's not the only thing. You can also have the reverse of that. So a system can feel like, so you can feel like you are being exploited, or you can feel like you're in danger, even or irrespective of whether a system is dangerous or not. So it really seems like, the feeling of privacy and the objective privacy are somehow kind of, to some extent, independent concepts. That when we do a design for privacy, we have to make the objective privacy work nicely, but this feeling or perception of privacy is equally important, or not. No, you can't really compare apples and oranges here, but they're both important for for the user to get a good product. Of course, objective privacy also influences the perception of privacy, especially such that if the user notices some indications of a breach, then they will of course get afraid. But there's lots of user interface components which can create perceptions of danger or safety when the object, or independent of the objective level of privacy. So I would expect that on this seminar series, or overall, privacy researchers are more focused on making actually private systems, and this perception part is less studied. And that's actually why I'm interested in. I somehow seem to always gravitate towards those questions which are less often studied. So then this clearly then becomes a user, because the perception and kind of user interface design clearly then are inherently tied concepts. So to make user interface design a good design for speech devices, then we really have to think about the perception of how privacy and other stuff is perceived. So the backend is not visible for the users. But then, so when you start to do some sort of user interface development, a typical first question, so the first step is to collect evidence, and then typically you would ask users questions related to that system you are designing. So quite often when I read papers about this, then the kind of researchers go out to users and ask them questions. For example, now that would you be willing to share holiday pictures on Facebook? So that would be a typical format of questions. Would you be willing to share something on this service or that? And so that corresponds then to speech devices. That would you be willing to share or do these tasks on a speech device? And that is as a question strategy, it's useful for the companies who sell those services and devices. Kind of, they want to know whether something is sellable, and then they ask this question, which is an indicator of how well they can sell this system. But it's a bit problematic in the sense that if you think about then Facebook or WhatsApp or some this sort of platforms which are used for communication, is that if all your friends are on this service already, you really cannot do an independent or kind of related to that system. So there's big penalties like in the interaction with your friends if you don't use that system. So then when you ask about willingness to share, you are not actually evaluating the willingness to share. You are evaluating the whole holistic system, which has some benefits and penalties, and then you evaluate those benefits with respect to penalties, and your answers are biased. And it's not really then related to the how good the system is. It's kind of much more complicated. So I don't really like that structure of questions. I mean, it doesn't drive towards good systems. It just drives towards sellable systems and services. So the underlying question here, so perhaps the other kind of question is, should we then educate the users first about these systems to be able to ask the questions? So we could approach this as like a driving license, that you have to be able to drive a car. You have to first be educated in driving, and then you have a test at the end, and then you are qualified enough to drive a car. So we could treat privacy in speech in that way, that we need to be educate the users such that they are qualified enough to use the systems. The problem is that then we would actually have, we would need some sort of guarantee that the users are educated, and how would that work then? The other approach is to treat privacy like airplanes, where the users, also the travelers, really don't have to know anything about airplane safety. I mean, it would be rather pointless to require that the travelers know the maintenance schedules of engine parts in airplane. I don't think anyone ever could be sufficiently educated in those these technical details of safety in airplanes enough that they could make an educated assessment of the safety. So that's why this leads to my conclusion, is that we always need regulation rather than education as the most important tool for providing safety on a holistic level. Of course, education is also good, and sometimes we need education. But anyway, so getting back to the user interface design task, is that I don't think we should go and ask them about devices, because that would require some more education about devices and privacy related to that. But instead, we should ask users about speech. So we should make questions related to privacy about speech. So how does privacy work when people speak? And we actually have a very good reference point for that, because people have been speaking for tens of thousands of years, or even hundreds of thousands of years, and we have shared information, and our culture has ingrained habits on how to handle privacy. So when I show you some pictures like this, starting, for example, now with the picture in the center, obviously this here is a privacy event. Kind of the girl is signaling privacy to both onlookers, but also to the boy. She wants to tell a secret to the boy. That's a privacy signaling or privacy habit ingrained in, at least in my culture. I assume that it's also in the same type of signaling in like the Asian cultures. But I actually don't know what the signaling methods are in Asian cultures, but this I know at least works nicely in Western cultures. I'm not sure if it is a very clear privacy signal in Western cultures, but that might not be applicable in Asian cultures. That we put the finger to the mouth, that's shh, that kind of silence or privacy, please. We should, in the same way, ask questions about kind of different physical environments. For example, now if there's a big crowd, or if you walk in a big crowd, you can actually be quite private in that big crowd. So if you have a friend with whom you talk in a big crowd, people walk past you. So even if they hear some part of the discussion, they hear only a small part. So then they cannot understand the bigger context. But in comparison, if you sit on a bus or on a tram or subway, if you talk private things here with your device or with someone else, then everyone in the neighborhood or around you will hear that, and they hear the whole context. So this would be a less private situation than this one. So this type of things, I think, which are involved in user interface design for privacy, how we perceive these different situations. So what we've done now in our team, so we haven't done too much research in this area, but a few studies on this line, and then we went out with users to different environments. For example, now office room with the door open and door closed, and the cafeteria, or out in the street, and then we asked them, or we had them in different discussions in these environments, and we asked them questions about, could you tell a secret to a friend in this environment? So really trying to decode how people feel about different environments and how they can discuss or talk in those environments, which level of privacy that gives you. And kind of our results here are that, well, kind of obvious that, of course, when you are in a kind of enclosed space, then you feel more private and you can have a private discussion. At the cafeteria, there's more people around, and then you can have less private discussions. And we really wanted to see the acoustic effect. So or kind of acoustic cues. So how well is this privacy or perception of privacy encoded in the acoustic signal, and that also really closely follows the experience of privacy of these the subjects. There's only one kind of interesting exception, so that in a silent office, well, now I'm sitting in a silent office here. Here, the audio signal does not really contain any cues about privacy. So silence is not a cue for privacy. Then you don't know if there is someone listening in the background. But so as soon as there is more background noises, then the listeners can evaluate whether this environment, so just from the audio, they can evaluate whether this interaction is private or not. So the people who are actually in this office then would use the visual cues then to kind of notice that this is actually a private environment. And so this is like the only exception where we found that the acoustic signal does not contain enough information about privacy. Anyway, so that's kind of one line of study you can do. And then you need to evaluate this type of questions in different environments. Now here is some examples of environments, how you would feel about privacy in this type of normal interactions and normal physical locations. And what I find then interesting here is to really look at what is kind of unique about each of these different types of scenarios and what is kind of common about these scenarios, to really try to categorize and label different effects of how we perceive privacy. And I need here a bit of examples now for those, or some of those pictures I showed here. So here is a lady talking on the phone. So it's, of course, talking to someone is an interpersonal event, and it happens through a device. So the through device is unique with that interaction. Here's a family at the dinner. And so that's, again, an interaction. So it's speech interaction. There could be devices here involved as well. But kind of the main interaction is this talk between the family or inside the family. Then if there are devices around it, you could ask for example, what's the calendar like tomorrow? So that's not the main interaction. That's a secondary interaction. The primary interaction is this talking with the family. In the cafeteria scenario, what is interesting here, what is this kind of the shared thing is, again, that you're discussing between people. But what is unique here is that quite often in kind of cafeteria scenarios or restaurant scenarios, people would sometimes talk in a big group. Let's say if you're eight people going together to the cafeteria, sometimes you talk in the whole group, and sometimes you split into separate smaller groups, and the kind of sometimes you change the permutation, that you talk for a while with these friends and then you change and talk a while with these friends. So the group assignment and the group permutation is rather dynamic and changes over time, and so the borders between groups are not really well defined. So that's a challenge for analysis of privacy in this sort of scenario. The team, this sort of team workshop or team like state stuff, that's also rather challenging for, or it kind of contains a lot of different levels. So for example, now there's multiple devices here, and kind of how would the multiple devices then interact in that privacy scenario when there can be, for example, representatives of different teams, or there can be bosses and employees. How does the privacy boundaries work when you have different hierarchies and customers and external parties? So that is a very complex privacy scenario in this sort of, or potentially complex privacy scenario. So this is kind of find it interesting here. But what is shared about this also, it's always interpersonal. Kind of speech is always about talking, so communicating with that other people. And when writing this, I actually realized that it's actually something which we haven't really thought about so much. So that's kind of funny. And then I kind of I looked a bit deeper to what kind of, so the message processing basically. So how we communicate. This is now a bit kind of step outside that kind of different topic. But in the communication sciences, they have a long history of thinking about how people talk and how to model discussions between people. And the kind of message passing is basically the first level. Interestingly enough, this linear model message passing type of thing that was introduced by Claude Shannon around the same time as he made his kind of important information theory. So around the same time, he also postulated this message passing construct for basically communication. Quite soon afterwards, communication scientists realized that that's a bit naive or like simplistic. It's much more an interactive model. So there's a feedback loop that when one discussion partner says something, then the other answers, and the next answer is kind of depends on all the prior answers. So in signal processing terms, kind of this is a bit like an FIR filter, whereas this is an autoregressive process where kind of all the past things influence how this discussion evolves. So you really cannot model it as a just linear model. It has to have this feedback loop. But even this is now kind of somehow insufficient or kind of incomplete model, because if you think about like a brainstorming event where you try to kind of jointly come up with new ideas, none of team members could create these new ideas alone. And that's why we do brainstorming, because when you discuss ideas with other people, they get refined, they become better, you create new ideas which would have not been possible in isolation. So the interaction creates the meaning. So it's the co-creation of meaning. And now this connects with the privacy in the sense that who really owns, whose idea is it if it's created jointly? None of the participants in the discussion actually owns the discussion because it's created jointly. And now our kind of whole privacy model, is based on a concept of personal privacy. I own information about myself, but speech is about interactions. So I don't really, even this talk now here today, even I haven't heard anything from the audience, but this kind of your silence during this talk is a communication to me. So all participants participate, even this monologue. So to record this, I had to ask you for permission, because this is not just me talking, this is an interaction between us. So personal privacy is a bit problematic concept overall in speech. And this kind of this actually, so when creating this talk, then I was a bit kind of struck by this problem. I tried to really look at different information sources or like categories in speech, really to try to categorize, kind of somehow characterize what is interpersonal and what is intrapersonal in speech. So I had from somewhere else, I had a rough list of information categories in speech, and then I labeled them, each of them, whether they are intrapersonal or interpersonal. So of course, health is my health, and my age and my size, physical size and my body type, those really are intrapersonal. So that I can contend with that. But I just showed that the linguistic content to most parts is actually interpersonal. So none of the discussion partners owns that linguistic content by themselves, with kind of political orientation and religious affiliation and that sort of stuff. They are about our relationships, group relationships, and so they are by definition interpersonal. Emotions is a bit more mixed bag. I mean, many emotions like love and happiness and hate are directed towards someone, so they are interpersonal. But there are also emotions like fear of physical danger, which kind of is not personal. So it's interpersonal, so it's just inside me. Relationships, of course, and power structures and familiarity can be kind of encoded in speech, and they really relate to the interpersonal situation. Location is perhaps not so much visible in or audible in the actual speech signal. It's also a mixture. Ethnic and cultural origin, of course, is very much audible in the speech signal, and kind of ethnic background and cultural origin, they are per definition group membership indicators, so they are interpersonal. So very kind of my conclusion here is that kind of very little about speech is actually intrapersonal. So there's very little personal privacy related to speech. It's mostly about interpersonal things. Now, then I tried to come up with counter arguments for this. So self-talk, for example. So if you talk alone by yourself, then there is no discussion partner. So then it really is my information, personal privacy sphere. But whether that is then important with respect to speech technology, I would say that that's a kind of minor or lesser thing. Thoughts are personal. They can have text form as well, but they are not really, as long as they are not vocalized, they don't, speech technology doesn't interact with that. And also emotions. So of course, if it's encoded in the speech signal, then that would then be personal privacy. So in all, I would say that these are not very strong counter arguments. They don't really have so much weight. So most information is interpersonal, and in interpersonal signals, we don't really have, the ownership concept is not well defined. So the obvious conclusion here is that the personal privacy in speech is somehow misleading. We have to be a bit careful with that. So then I went a bit forward. So now kind of this whole thing has evolved throughout the preparation here. So I made here a few models, kind of interpersonal privacy models. So now, if Alice and Bob are talking, that's a primary interaction, and so that it's then a question about how. So if Alice has a secret, how not to reveal that. So that's really the personal privacy kind of level. How not to reveal a secret to Bob. Of course, we make mistakes. We sometimes reveal secrets, kind of basically slip of tongue or Freudian kind of slips. Kind of, they have lots of names, which also actually reveals how ingrained privacy is in our culture. That we have kind of these concepts about privacy in common understanding. Anyway, so but this is kind of not a very interesting. So the primary interaction is not for interpersonal things. It's not the most common privacy problem in communication. I think this secondary interaction is much more interesting. So suppose now Alice and Bob are having a private discussion, for example, at dinner, so at the restaurant. So this is the primary interaction. And then there's a waitress, Eve, who comes by. So the question is then, to which extent does Eve have permission to hear things about this primary interaction? Typically, if I talk with my wife at dinner and then the waitress comes, then I would stop talking when the waitress comes. So at least if it's a kind of private matter. If I talk about football and politics, then perhaps Eve has some meaningful contribution to that, so she can be included. So it really depends on the context, whether Eve is allowed to participate in discussion. And of course, Eve can have, I mean, if she brings the kind of food, she kind of has some information which we want to have. So there's also actually purposeful interaction in this secondary interaction. But so it's still a restricted interactor in comparison to this primary interaction. All right. But so just this ownership kind of concept was the other thing which we need to then discuss in the human-to-human level things. So who owns a discussion is basically a strange question, and how do we manage? So how do we jointly manage access to third parties? So if I have a discussion with my wife or a good friend, what am I allowed to tell a third party? So what am I allowed to tell a colleague? That's a sensitive question. So I really have to consciously think about what things I'm allowed to tell that third party. Okay, but then kind of coming back to the speech technology. So how does these observations about privacy in human-to-human communication relate to speech technology? So we can draw the same pictures now, or before the pictures. Now kind of these are the types of scenarios I'm thinking about. So if we have devices involved, or devices just present, here we could have some devices present which are not part of the primary interaction. And even here we could have devices present which are not part of the primary interaction. But anyway, so kind of we get this type of models. So we can have a primary interaction with an agent, so a speech device or speech service, and then it's about what Alice reveals in that interaction. But much more kind of potent or kind of difficult cases are where the agent is secondary. So we have, let's say, talk at home, and then this is a smart speaker kind of present while I talk with my wife. So then the question is how much the service is allowed to process of information from this primary interaction. Then there are cases where there's a primary agent and there's a secondary service. Actually, I have, so this is now when I want to order pizza, how much, so if I order pizza through a speech interface, how much do others have access to that? So other services. Bit more detail here. So Alice can reveal things which she doesn't intend, and here I think Alice or users have no awareness of, like in human-to-human communication, they know the consequences and then they know what to avoid. So the problem is mostly with the superhuman capabilities. So for example, the agent can remember all interactions forever. So then kind of that's different than humans. Humans would forget. But also the agent can analyze, for example, health from medical information, which we don't really have understanding of. So that's the question of how do we feel about that? And then in this, where the agent is a secondary kind of interactor, then the question is, how should the agent be treated with respect to privacy? So should it be similar as a waitress or a human personal assistant that we just kind of So is that the way we should treat them, or should it be different, or is it different? That sort of questions is what is interesting. And then finally, it was this model where we have, let's say I order pizza through Alexa. So is then Alexa, so of course this pizza service then gets to know my, for example, my credit card number. But if I share my credit card number with the pizza service, is Alexa allowed to also store that credit card number? So this sort of kind of questions are interesting when you have multiple agents available. Or when I kind of order this pizza, is this pizza service then allowed to share that information with an advertiser, such that the advertiser knows that I like pizza? Now, kind of looking at the time, we still have a bit of time. So kind of there's a related question here that do we perceive the personal assistant like an extension of self or an external agent? So where does the privacy boundary go? So now, as a comparison, now if I use a computer, so the desktop computer, if I browse internet, go to a say news site, then the interaction with the news site is where I feel a privacy boundary. So it's this boundary then. That's what I feel. And the agent, so the browser, feels like an extension of myself. So I'm kind of ready to reveal lots of things to my desktop computer, but then the news, so the website here, I'm much more reluctant to share information over there. But so the question is, to which extent are speech devices then extensions of self or external agents? And that's, I just posed it here as a question now. I don't have more studies on that. So as a conclusion now, my kind of really paradoxical conclusion from this presentation is that there's very little personal about speech, which is, I think, I was a bit surprised to make this statement as a privacy enthusiast. But my kind of thing is that, so that my conclusion is that really speech is about interactions. So the kind of privacy in speech is then about protecting those interactions. Of course, there's also the primary interaction has things we want to protect, but this secondary interaction level is something which is not addressed so much, and that's something I'm interested in looking forward with. And then finally, privacy design is kind of both objective privacy protections and then the perception of privacy. And since most works that I have kind of seen about privacy in speech are about those objective privacy protections, I think we should, as a community, focus more on the perception side, think more about the user interface design questions. And that's also what led me to these exciting side paths here in this presentation.